Imagine this carefully. You live in one of the safest countries on earth. Crime is low. Institutions are stable. The air is clean. The water is drinkable. The land is green. The politics, by global standards, are calm. International rankings routinely place this country near the top for quality of life, for governance, for peace. And yet, people are leaving. Not slowly, not temporarily, but in record numbers. In the year to August, 134,000 people left New Zealand, the highest annual figure ever recorded. That's a 37% increase over the year before. Between January and June of 2024 alone, another 88,000 citizens departed. In just 6 months, nearly 1.5% of the entire population was gone. These are not tourist boarding planes. They are not backpackers or students or retirees. They are nurses, teachers, engineers, tradespeople, young professionals, parents, people in their prime working years, the people every functioning society depends on. So the question isn't why people want to travel. The question is far more unsettling. How did one of the most stable, peaceful, and prosperous nations in the world become a place its own citizens no longer feel they can afford to live in or plan a future in? Because what's happening in New Zealand is not an anomaly, it's a warning. And to understand how this happened, we need to go back. Not 5 years, not 10, but 40. In 1984, New Zealand embarked on one of the most radical economic transformations ever attempted by a developed democracy. The reforms became known as Rogernomics. At the time, the country faced real challenges. Inflation was high, growth was sluggish, and the old post-war economic model was showing strain. The solution, policymakers argued, was speed and scale. Within just a few years, New Zealand dismantled large parts of its welfare state to state-owned enterprises were privatized. Tariffs were slashed, financial markets were deregulated. Labor protections were weakened. The goal was simple: make the economy leaner, more efficient, more competitive. And in some ways, it worked. Inflation fell, markets opened, foreign capital flowed in. But there was a cost, one that wouldn't show up immediately in GDP figures. Factories closed faster than new industries emerged. Whole regions lost their economic anchors. Job security declined. Public services shrank. By the early 2000s, government spending had fallen from 42% of GDP to just 34%. The promise was that the private sector would step in, invest, innovate, and lift productivity. That never fully happened. Productivity growth slowed and slipped below the OECD average, where it remains today. Inequality widened. Industrial capacity hollowed out. And most importantly, the implicit social contract, the idea that hard work would be rewarded with stability and upward mobility, began to erode. This matters, because once that contract breaks, everything that follows becomes harder to fix. Modern New Zealand presents itself as a diversified, advanced economy. But beneath the surface, its structure is surprisingly narrow. Two sectors dominate: tourism and agriculture. Before the pandemic, tourism accounted for roughly 5% of GDP and directly employed around 1 in 9 workers. Entire towns and regions depended on the steady flow of international visitors. That dependence became painfully clear in 2020. When borders closed, GDP contracted. Businesses collapsed almost overnight. Workers were laid off en masse. Government support softened the blow, but the vulnerability was exposed. Tourism has recovered, partially. International arrivals are still well below their 2019 peak. And recent policy decisions, including a sharp increase in visitor taxes, risk suppressing demand further. Agriculture, the other pillar, tells a similar story. It contributes another 5% of GDP and over 65% of merchandise exports. Dairy, meat, wine, globally competitive industries. But they are heavily dependent on migrant labor. Before COVID, roughly 1 in 5 agricultural workers was a migrant. When borders closed, crops were left unharvested. Entire seasons were lost. Industry losses exceeded $100 million in a single year. Now add environmental targets necessary but costly and rising compliance expenses. Many small and medium farmers simply cannot absorb the investment required to meet new methane reduction goals. The result is an economy that looks strong in good conditions, but trembles under stress. Tourism depends on global stability. Agriculture depends on weather, labor flows, and international demand. This is not resilience, that is exposure. If productivity stagnates, wages stagnate. And in New Zealand, that reality has been playing out for years. Inflation surged after the pandemic, peaking above 7% in mid-2022. To contain it, the Reserve Bank raised interest rates aggressively. That move cooled inflation, but it also cooled everything else. Borrowing became expensive. Business expansion slowed. Hiring froze. Meanwhile, everyday costs kept climbing. Food prices rose nearly 9% year on year. Rents continued to increase. Energy costs stayed elevated. New Zealanders now work more hours than the OECD average, yet produce significantly less per hour. And despite working longer, real wages fail to rise. Nearly 40% of full-time workers earn below the median wage. Almost half of renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing alone. At the same time, profit margins have held firm. The top 1% of earners now take home over 8% of all taxable income, double their share in the early 2000s. The bottom half of households owns just 2% of national wealth. This isn't just inequality, that it's structural imbalance. For younger generations, the implications are severe. Graduates entering the workforce today earn less in real terms than their counterparts 15 years ago. Job security has declined. Precarious employment, casual contracts, gig work, zero-hour arrangements has become normalized. This isn't a temporary squeeze. It's a permanent downgrade in expectations. If one issue defines modern New Zealand, it's housing. Between 2000 and 2021, real house prices rose by 256%, one of the largest increases in the developed world. Housing stopped being treated as shelter and became a financial asset. With no comprehensive capital gains tax, generous investor incentives, and weak regulation, property speculation flourished. By 2022, over 40% of residential purchases were made by investors, not owner-occupiers. At the same time, supply failed to keep pace. Zoning laws limited density. Infrastructure funding lagged. Construction costs surged more than 30% in 4 years. Building approvals collapsed. The result is a market that is nearly impossible to enter and extremely difficult to escape. The median house price sits near $780. The median income is under $70,000. That gap is not bridged by effort. It's structural. Over 110,000 people now live in severe housing deprivation. Emergency housing costs billions annually. Programs like Kiwi Build have delivered only a fraction of what was promised. Housing is no longer just expensive, it is destabilizing. When housing consumes income, everything else suffers, especially public systems. Transport networks are congested and underfunded. Water systems are aging and frequently failing. Hospitals operate beyond capacity. Schools decay. Across transport, healthcare, education, utilities, the story is the same: deferred maintenance, delayed investment, and short-term fixes. These failures don't just inconvenience people. They reduce productivity. They increase stress. They push people to look elsewhere. A country can tolerate high taxes or high costs, but not high costs combined with failing services. And so people leave, not because they hate New Zealand, but because the numbers no longer add up. Doctors trained at public expense move overseas. Teachers accept higher pay and better conditions abroad. Engineers follow opportunity. Graduates calculate their future and choose to build it somewhere else. Over 30% of New Zealand-trained doctors now work overseas. Hundreds of teachers leave every year. Skill migration into the country has slowed, while emigration accelerates. This is not a brain drain, it's a hollowing out. And unlike past cycles, many are not planning to return. New Zealand was once presented as a model, proof that prosperity, fairness, and environmental stewardship could coexist. That vision hasn't disappeared, but it is under strain. This is not the failure of individuals, IT is the outcome of long-term policy choices. Choices that favored assets over labor, short-term efficiency over long-term resilience, and market solutions over public investment. This isn't just a cost of living crisis. It's a crisis of confidence in the future. And the final question isn't whether New Zealand can change course. It's whether it will, before too many people decide the future lies somewhere else. Because when even paradise becomes unaffordable, no country is immune.